Welcome back, students, to Chapter 17 of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. A couple of vocabulary words before we read this chapter. Loathed means to dislike something very, very strongly. When you loathe something, you really do not like it. Preferable is something that you prefer or desire. So if we use the root word here, prefer, we are making a choice between two or more things. Do you prefer chocolate or vanilla? So I find something preferable means that's the choice that I make. That's the one that I prefer. Limited means something is in a very small amount or there's not very much of it. So if I said, well, we have limited chocolate in my pantry, we better go to the grocery store, it means I don't have a lot in there. And that's a problem for me. A couple of other things that we're going to see in this chapter is references to a chicken coop. Here's an example of what one would look like. So when people keep chickens, they usually have a place for them to sleep at night, and they generally lay their eggs in their chicken coop. And then the last thing we're going to see a reference to is a kerosene lamp. Before there was electricity, or when we don't have electricity, often people use kerosene lamps. Oil goes down at the bottom of the lamp, and then we light the oil, and then that is what creates the flame and the light. It's kind of like a candle, except that in a candle, the flame is out in the open. And a kerosene lamp, you see that it's enclosed in glass. Okay, so if you don't have electricity and it's dark out, you might use a kerosene lamp. All right, let's get started with Chapter 17, and let's see what Bryce has in store for Edward this time. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder. He started to walk. "I come to get you for Sarah Ruth," Bryce said. "You don't know Sarah Ruth. She's my sister. She's sick. She had her a baby doll made out of china. She loved that baby doll, but he broke it. He broke it. He was drunk and stepped on that baby's head and smashed it into 100 million pieces. Them pieces was so small, I couldn't make them go back together. I couldn't. I tried and I tried." At this point in his story, Bryce stopped walking and shook his head and wiped at his nose with the back of his hand. Sarah Ruth had nothing to play with since. He won't buy her nothing. He says she don't need nothing. He says she don't need nothing because she ain't going to live. But he don't know. Bryce started to walk again. "He don't know," he said. Who he was not clear to Edward. What was clear was that he was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll. How Edward loathed dolls. And to be thought of as a likely replacement for a doll offended him. But still it was, he had to admit, a highly preferable alternative to hanging by his ears from a post. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived was so small and crooked that Edward did not believe at first that it was a house. He mistook it instead for a chicken coop. Inside there were 2 beds and a kerosene lamp and not much else. Bryce laid Edward at the foot of one of the beds and then lit the lamp. "Sarah," Bryce whispered. "Sarah Ruth. You gotta wake up now, honey. I brung you something." He took the harmonica out of his pocket and played the beginning of a simple melody. The little girl sat up in her bed and immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand on her back. "That's all right," he told her. "That's okay." She was young, maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair. And even in the poor light of the lamp, Edward could see that her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. "That's right," said Bryce. "You go on ahead and cough." Sarah Ruth obliged him. She coughed and coughed and coughed. On the wall of the cabin, the kerosene light cast her trembling shadow, hunched over and small. The coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard, sadder even than the mournful call of the whippoorwill. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped. Sarah Ruth does not seem very healthy, does she? I'm a little worried about them. Bryce said, "You want to know what I brung you?" Sarah Ruth nodded. "You got to close your eyes." The girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing straight, like a soldier at the end of the bed. "All right, now you can open them." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes, and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms, so it looked as if he were dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her hands. "Rabbit," she said. "He's for you, honey," said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward, then at Bryce, and then back at Edward again, her eyes wide and disbelieving. "He's yours." "Mine." Sarah Ruth, Edward was soon to discover, rarely said more than one word at a time. Words, at least several of them strung together, made her cough. She limited herself. She said only what needed to be said. "Yours," said Bryce. "I got 'em special for you." This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and she hunched over again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. "That's right," said Bryce. He handed Edward to her. "Baby," said Sarah Ruth. She rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him and smiled. Never in his life had Edward been cradled like a baby. Abilene had not done it, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was a singular sensation to be held so gently and yet so fiercely, to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body flood with warmth. "You going to give him a name, honey?" Bryce asked. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth, without taking her eyes off Edward. "Jangles, huh? That's a good name. I like that name." Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head. She continued to stare down at Edward. "Hush," she said to Edward, as she rocked him back and forth. "From the minute I first seen him," said Bryce, "I knew he belonged to you. I said to myself, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth, for sure." "Jangles," murmured Sarah Ruth. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on the tin roof. Sarah Ruth rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song keep rhythm with the rain. Wow, it seems like Edward has really found someone who loves him and who he can feel love back. And I really can see a picture of the little girl holding Edward like a baby and tenderly taking care of him like she would a baby. Let's see what happens in Chapter 18 next.